What if I told you that McLaren knew Piastri's car was damaged before the Brazilian GP began, but they didn't do anything about it until it was too late? How much can a driver tolerate before breaking down when his team stops trusting him? Oscar Piastri arrived in Brazil full of expectations, but also with increasing pressure. Interlagos not only represented a mathematical opportunity to cut points against his teammate Lando Norris, but a symbolic test to show that he could withstand the pressure of fighting for a championship in the final stretch of the season. The atmosphere at McLaren was tense. Norris' lead was beginning to consolidate, and although Piastri was still in the fight, each mistake was beginning to cost more. From the first day of activities on the track, something didn't add up. While Norris seemed comfortable with his MCL39, recording competitive times from the first practice, Piastri's car showed erratic behavior. The Australian's feelings were confusing. He reported an unusual lack of stability in high-load curves, key areas of the Brazilian track such as the Senna S and the Lake Curve. It was not a question of lack of rhythm, but a disconnection between what he asked of the car and what it delivered in response. Although everything seemed in order on paper, the telemetries did not reveal any obvious failures. That was the first alarm signal. In Formula One, when the driver feels something that the data cannot explain, it is almost always the prelude to a deeper problem. Andrea, Stella and her technical team began to investigate, but time was against them. The sprint classification was approaching and the margin to make fundamental changes was minimal. Piastri faced the sprint classification with a car that simply did not allow him to push to the limit. Every curve became an uncertain bet. The car seemed alive from behind, reacting with a fraction of a second delay, which generated insecurity and mental exhaustion. On a circuit like Interlagos, where every thousandth counts, that small disconnection between driver and machine is brutally amplified. He finished outside the top 10. And worse still, in the sprint race he would suffer an accident that not only compromised his result, but also forced the team to thoroughly inspect the car. What they found was the beginning of technical collapse. The accident was just the trigger. What really buried the Australian's dream was what was revealed behind the scenes. A series of structural and technical failures that had been affecting Piastri's car since previous races, and that Brazil simply pushed to the limit. The consequences were immediate. With a compromised car, no confidence in his work tool, and seeing how Norris extended his lead in the championship, Piastri left Interlagos with a disadvantage of 24 points. Not only did he lose ground in the table, he also lost the narrative of leading driver within McLaren. At that time, Brazil was not just a sporting defeat. It was a psychological break. A cruel reminder that, in Formula One, it is not always the most talented who wins, but rather the one who has the appropriate technical and strategic support behind him. And that weekend, Oscar Piastri didn't have it. The true origin of the Oscar Piastri disaster in Brazil began long before the lights went out at Interlagos. What was discovered in the analysis of the car after the sprint race was a problem so subtle, so tiny and so difficult to detect, that any other team would have missed it. But an almost microscopic detail ended up becoming one of the most decisive turning points of the entire season. McLaren engineers found a microfracture in the hydraulic actuator of the rear suspension system pressure valve. To the average viewer, this may sound like minor damage, something that is easily repaired. However, within the architecture of a Formula One car, this actuator is the organ that regulates the dynamic behavior of the car in real time. A very delicate piece designed to react with surgical speed every time the pilot brakes, accelerates or changes direction. It is a component that works under constant pressure, responding to minimal variations, and whose stability defines the precision of the rear axle. This microfracture generated a minimum loss of pressure at very specific times, especially during intense braking and changes of support at high speed. From the outside, the car looked healthy. In the most superficial data too. But the moment the MCL39 entered a fast corner, the suspension delayed its response by just a few milliseconds. For an elite driver like Piastri, this translates into an immediate feeling of insecurity. The car felt loose at the rear, slightly off the hook as if it was reacting late to your inputs. The kind of behavior that disconnects any pilot from their natural confidence. Interlagos, with its sequence of fast-linked curves, abrupt gradients and critical braking, magnified that almost invisible difference. Each lap became a mental survival exercise. Piastri had to anticipate something he could not predict. The car moved erratically, sometimes steady, other times nervously, with no clear pattern. This inconsistency not only slows down, psychologically draining. It pushes the driver to hesitate, overcorrect, and modify his or her driving style in unnatural ways. And any emotional or technical change in the driver's mentality is paid for with time on the track. The most dramatic thing is that this type of failure does not appear clearly in standard telemetry. The difference in pressure was so small that it remained within apparently normal margins. Only when they began to analyze correlated data from the last few races did a pattern emerge. The rear end of Piastri's car behaved slightly less stable than Norris's in high-load corners, but was still stable enough not to trigger any immediate alarms. Damage only emerged under extreme conditions. The mistake in the sprint race acted as a final amplifier. The sudden loss of grip at a point where the car should have been more predictable confirmed the suspicion that something mechanical was failing. When the team disassembled the car and found the microfracture, the emotional blow was strong. It wasn't just a recent failure. It was a failure that had probably accompanied him for more than one race. A cumulative problem that had limited his performance without anyone knowing. The Interlagos circuit, with its abrupt elevation changes, blind corners, aggressive curbs and very marked compression zones, is a technical trap for this type of components. And McLaren, like other teams, faced a dilemma after observing where levels run at the legal limit and risk losing all points, or slightly raise the car's rake, that is, its inclination to reduce friction with the asphalt and protect the integrity of the plate. They chose the latter. But that decision came at a very high price, especially for Piastri. By raising the car, McLaren altered the aerodynamic balance, altering the way airflow interacted with the flat bottom and diffuser. The MCL39 was designed to ride extremely close to the ground. Its design exploits ground effect to the maximum, channeling air through complex lower structures to generate downforce without generating drag. When the car is lifted, that efficiency plummets. The problem is not just aerodynamic. Raising the rake also alters the dynamic center of gravity, weight transfer during braking and cornering, and the way the suspension responds to surface changes. At Interlagos, where the asphalt is uneven and the curves require stability in the rear axle, that small change became a punishment. For a car like Piastri's, already unstable due to hydraulic problems and undiagnosed microfractures, that additional lift was the final sentence. The car began to show more aggressive understeer on corner entry and a loss of traction on exit, especially in the second sector. Tire degradation became more pronounced, and the feeling of disconnection increased. Piastri reported that the car did not respond as expected, that rear grip was lost prematurely, and that corrections had to be constant to keep it on the track. At that point, McLaren could no longer reverse the decision. They had chosen the conservative route, as any team would have done in his place. But the damage was done. Piastri was competing with an unbalanced, de-optimized car, modified to comply with a regulation instead of winning a race. And in a championship where every point counts, that loss of performance became a burden. Even more serious was the psychological impact. For a driver who had already felt that his car was different, that development was less favorable to him, and that his decisions were called into question, seeing how his team decided to protect the regulations instead of pushing to the limit deepened the feeling of isolation. It wasn't just a technical issue. It was also a symbolic sign. The risk was no longer justified for him. This situation exposed one of the eternal dilemmas of modern Formula One, the balance between performance and legality. The decision to raise the car's height probably saved the team from a penalty, but also jeopardized one of Piastri's last chances to cut points off Norris. A silent sacrifice that was not seen on television, that was not explained in the communications, but that defined, to a large extent, the destiny of their season. Oscar Piastri did not lose the 2025 championship in a single corner, nor in a single race. He lost it in a silent, cumulative, insidious process. A process that began with a collision in Baku that was apparently resolved, that was fueled by an undetectable microfracture in the rear suspension, that became irreversible when he chose a different suspension configuration than that of his teammate, and that was sealed at Interlagos when the team, out of necessity, raised the height of the car to avoid disqualification. Leave me your opinion in the comments what you think about all this.